designed in a certain way, and you're going to be disadvantaged. I am actually quite hopeful about the new UN Women, which is being led by Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile. I think it's a terrific opportunity, and this is exactly the kind of issue that she is going to focus on and that she's bringing attention to. And so I hope that you'll reinforce what she's doing there. I think the second point is that in most of these cases, we're really looking for change drivers. Who is most likely to advance or deliver change? And I know in programs that I've worked in, I've always looked at women and youth because generally they did not create the conflict. They were either exploited in it or suffered from it, but they were brought along through the conflict as opposed to being the catalyst. So they have the biggest investment in change. But that means we've got to run a lot more resources through them. We can't just give them the symbolic role. We really actually have to give them the people and the money. And I know I worked with some of you on the Rwanda, the Women in Transition program in Rwanda, but it has such a simple design. The design was basically, we can't go back to, Carol Peasley's here, we worked on this a long time ago. You can't go back to Hutus and Tutsis. You can't go back to any of the existing divisions of the country and say, okay, we're going to build trust and we'll get everybody back into a new state of mind. So we kind of had to find what was left, and the dominant demographic of the country was that 70% of the population, we thought, after the genocide, was probably going to be women, and the women-led households were going to obviously be dominating, and so men almost always need women, and Hutus do not always need Tutsis. So let's at least advance the women, and we have to find a terrific partner because she was the only woman in the cabinet, the new cabinet. She had been the chief fundraiser for the rebel forces, so she had standing, and of course she had the weakest ministry. So we were able to do something that Tom suggested, which was to really take her very weak ministry and double its capacity almost immediately with local people and give it then some liquidity. And suddenly she was playing in communities all over the country in a way that nobody else in Kigali was able to do that fast. So it did have the right foundation. But on your question of who do you listen to, I'm a big, big fan of weight of the evidence and the wisdom of the crowds. And I think that, and this really goes back to somebody that I know a lot of you know, and that's Bob Gersoni. He's probably held you captive in a room for one of his briefings at some stage of your lives, and having benefited from that hostage moment at least once, I can assure you that I was convinced that approach of going out and really listening to people and not directing them with surveys, but letting them take you where they need to take you, and doing it in an iterative fashion, the way a good journalist would do it, or a good anthropologist would do it, that after you've talked to 300 or 400 of these people, if you are not sensitive, in particular to the political concerns, again, that were mentioned, and you're not picking those up, then you're in outright denial, which a lot of us are, because the difficulty of these cases and the enormity of the challenge is so great that going into denial is the insane thing to do. But this really keeps you from doing that and forces you, again, to focus in on, what I really heard over and over and over again is this. So I very much appreciate that you have a wonderful program on whatever it happens to be, but actually, unless it's going to tackle this problem, you're number 17 in the list of issues. So while we worked on landmines in Angola with Don, because we had done something that was an interesting test, then the U.S. government immediately wanted us to do that everywhere else. And we said, no, it's not a huge problem in Rwanda. It's not that big a problem in Bosnia. We cannot become the office of landmines, even though it's a serious problem. You have to keep being driven by what you hear. Otherwise, you have to be the smartest person in the room all the time. And that is a burden that is really not, that I've never seen anybody other than Bill Clinton be able to sustain very well.
Thank you. And again, I think food for thought for the audience. I wanted to just ask this question on an issue that you raised, Alonso, about the silos. And in fact, Balzolik addressed that yesterday as well when he referred to silos between humanitarian assistance and development. There are silos, and I think, again, we're getting better at understanding that between, civil and military. What have we learned about, managing and perhaps breaking down some of those?
I think the bottom line is that we've got to recognize that it's not a zero-sum game. In 2001, the world changed forever in regards to how we implement these types of programs in the field. I think that the issue continues to be, back to my previous point, it's about resources. If we have transitional programs that are set up to transition, or their emergency response programs, there has to be a delineation of when they're going to end. And everybody's going to argue their case as hard as they can that, it's just not quite there yet. But we've got to have everybody in the room when those programs are being designed, that this is your cutoff date, this is when the transition begins. Then we go from transition to long-term development. But there's never honest discussion about it. Everybody gives you the bobblehead in the meeting, yep, you're absolutely right. Everybody goes back to their offices and then they go, we're not doing that. And 9 months later, there's another major disaster in play, and people forget what decisions were made. I think that it's back to the partnership piece. How do we get everybody in the room to make some strategic decisions that this is how we're going to play in the sandbox? I think that the civil-mil relationship is one that I know there's a lot of angst in the room about that. I think we live in a time where we have logistic and lift capacity in very, very dangerous places that we have to take advantage of. And everybody can't play in that sphere because they may not want to, and that's part of their corporate culture. But we can't leave unabated space for people, bad guys, to do bad things to us and other free nations. And I think that there's going to have to be a meeting of the minds on this in regards to, hey, by the way, everybody knows the elephant in the room is Somalia. How do we take all of our experiences that we've had over the last 10 years and make sure that we don't make the same mistakes in Somalia? And I think that that's going to be the key in regards to how we grow this relationship between CivMil in a progressive and strategic way. I think also that we also have to understand that from a monitoring and evaluation standpoint, there are going to be things that may be measurable in a Mali or a Ghana, but they may not be measurable in an Afghanistan or Pakistan in the same way. And there has to be some acceptance that there are going to be some failures. And we'd be willing to take those risks. But I think the stovepiping is really about a zero-sum game mentality. And we as a government and as implementers of these types of programs have to become much more strategic about this. Otherwise, we're going to face serious constraints in the out years.
Thank you. Don, you had a comment?
Just a comment on Somalia, because it is the elephant in the room right now. About a year ago, through various techniques, FuseNet, which looks on the ground, informational interviews, we did identify a very strong likelihood that the worst rain conditions in 60 years was going to present massive malnutrition, massive hunger throughout the region. And at that point, we said we need a three-part strategy here. The first part is to pre-position food in the region. So we sent a lot of food out to Djibouti, South Africa, etc., so that we could be ready for, frankly, what we're seeing now when, unfortunately, the dynamic has come into play. And so what we're looking at there is $460 million worth of assistance that we've provided over the last 10 months for that purpose. But we said we don't want to just be focused on feeding people in humanitarian camps or out in the field. And we said we want to strengthen the resiliency of communities by providing a safety net. And so we went out with food for work and cash for work programs to produce wells, to provide catchment areas. Just take Ethiopia, where I just was in the refugee camps about a week 4.5 million people are affected by this drought and suffering malnutrition in Ethiopia, but 7.5 million have been helped by these assistance programs to enhance the resiliency of societies such that they're not in need of food assistance. And in the last go-round on one of these situations, we had 12 million people in Ethiopia who needed our assistance. And so we have helped with 7.5 who now are much more resilient. But the third piece is the long-term development approach. And we have active programs with Kenya, with Ethiopia, with Uganda, with all of the countries in the region under the Feed the Future program to build up the capacity of these countries to address their own malnutrition problems. And so indeed, it isn't just a question of starting with humanitarian assistance and then moving into relief, moving into recovery, and finally moving into development. That would be an ideal approach if it worked. I will point out that in 1975, I wrote my master's project at the University of Toronto on the subject relief, recovery to development. So we've been dealing with this issue for 35 years. We still haven't come up with all the answers here. The last thing I wanted to do was simply to announce a decision indeed that was taken yesterday, not on the debt ceiling, sorry, but regarding our assistance in Somalia, because we have now decided to provide OFAC licenses to exempt NGOs and US and UN agencies that need to go in, even if they have to deal in a marginal way with Al-Shabaab. We have taken decisions regarding the material support provisions of our terrorism law. We have looked and reinterpreted and are working with the United Nations to allow us to move more actively. The burden now is clearly on the local communities, and in particular Al-Shabaab, to provide the security, to provide the access that they need to operate. But let me just reassure you by citing one statement by one of our leading counterterrorism officers within the debate on this subject. He said, and it really hit home, what is counterterrorism about if it's not about saving lives? And that, frankly, has to be the motivation that we all face.
Thank you. Let me open it up for some questions. We just have a few minutes because we were running a little late. We're a little squeezed because we were late at starting. Yes, please.
Thank you. Cecilia Lopez from Colombia. Colombia has received a lot of money for the war on drugs, something that we haven't heard a word here. That's the real political meaning, I think, of the help we have received in Colombia. We put the casualties, dead people, the corruption that drugs bring in, the change of values, and you put the money. There are 3 former presidents of Latin America that are opening the debate about drugs, and they have said that the war on drugs is a failure. My question is the United States open to that debate? Thank you.
Are you done?
Yeah. And if we can keep both the questions and the answers brief so we can get through a couple of these before we have to close.
We've said as a government for a long time that it isn't just the supply side, it is the demand side as well. And we do definitely have to deal with demand considerations in the United States if that is the emphasis. They have suggested decriminalization. That is not the policy of the Obama administration. But there's no question that drugs represent a threat not only to countries that are producers, but transit countries. I mean, right now Guinea-Bissau is essentially falling apart because transnational organized crime networks dealing in drug trafficking are operating there. But they're a threat to the United States, Western Europe, and other donors. And I think we always have to recognize that even as the primary motivation primarily to many of the American constituencies we have to reach out to, is that societies that are prosperous and moving in the right direction don't traffic in drugs, in people, in arms. They don't spew out large numbers of refugees across borders and even across oceans. They don't harbor pirates or terrorists, and they don't serve as transmission points for pandemic diseases. And so, indeed, we have to, in our motivational discussion, talk a lot about what is in it for the American people. But, indeed, the real emphasis for most of us in this room is how do we build stable societies that have income levels that are constantly increasing.
Thank you. Rick, did you want to have a comment?
I think the only thing I'd say is I think this is an issue that actually gets a little bit to the stovepiping as well, because we have extremely strong industries now within our governmental systems on countering drugs, on counter narcotics. But and you see in a case like the Somalia case, where you end up having at least 3 masters. You have the huge human suffering and misery problem, perhaps on a scale that we haven't seen in decades. And then we have this counterterrorism imperative. And then we also have, how do we keep a group of neighbors more or less happy? And we obviously saw competing interests in Afghanistan as well in the early days of Afghanistan that really crippled our policy. So that we have to do a better job of sorting that out. And I do think that this is, again, a case where if we were really better grounded in the place, rather than that we have these huge global imperatives that we're pursuing, sometimes with a tone deference to what the circumstances are. I think that the programs, I don't have a great understanding of the Colombia program, and obviously you mentioned it earlier, but I think in the Colombia case, we, in particular the last couple of years, we've gotten a richness of approaches, and I think Don or Alonso mentioned earlier that if we had done some of the things in Afghanistan that we're doing now at the front end, our success would have been much, much greater. And so again, it's getting started in the right direction. If you think you're going to vacation in California and you find yourself in Belgium, you've made a mistake. And so the fact that you made the effort to get on the plane doesn't really give you that much of a reward.
All right, good. Let's take a question from this side, and in fact, maybe we take a couple of questions. Yeah.
I'm Tony Barkley. Great panel. Rick led off early by saying that with the understanding that's shared in the room and by the panel of how important local ownership is, it's still an area where in post-conflict work there's less performance than potential. I wonder if the situation isn't made more difficult by what has been the experience, particularly in Afghanistan over the last 3 or 4 years, where you have 2 very strong sources of pressure. One is on the expenditure rate, the burn rate. I know USAID often found itself in the interagency process being compared unfavorably with the CERP funds because the money didn't move so fast. A lot of the implementing partners have felt the pressure, felt the encouragement, the incentive to speed up expenditure. Then you have the oversight, the compliance and bar having been raised increasingly higher to make sure that no dollar goes astray. Do those complicate the local ownership issue?
Okay, thank you, Tony. Yes, we can take it.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding me that my years in post-conflict areas. Ricardo Sirici is the president of the Canadian SID chapter of Ottawa-Gatineau. In areas where there is an active military external intervention, say Afghanistan, how can both private consultancy firms and NGOs contribute to a certain long-term sustainable development approach when they find themselves side by side with external troops and they can be perceived as part of this forcing group and then jeopardize all the effort. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And let's take the next question.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, yes, it's good to go direct to the community, but I'm worried about sustainability. When will you go? Will you stay there bringing this assistance? How will it be sustainable? Then there is the issue of use, because the people who work for you, whom you have brought in, will be elevated in earnings, and they will be the envy of even the people in government. How are we going to balance this? Thirdly, when planning this assistance to the locals, going direct to the people, are they involved from the beginning of the project or the assistance, or it comes finished and they only need to implement? Lastly,
I thought I said one question.
yeah, just tell us. The last one is this: when you have brought the assistance from US, from wherever, UN and what, you have now opened the gate to the rulers to take all the remaining resources that have been collected for the treasury, and we have seen it happen. How do you reconcile that?
Okay, I'm going to take the gentleman on the far right, and then close it for.
Thank you. Tom Bammond from Catholic Relief Services. A study about 25 years of conflict in sub-Saharan Africa identified about 6 major risk factors. The 2 that were highlighted most, this was for Par and others, highlighted the so-called youth bulge and what's called horizontal inequalities. That is, inequalities of a variety of kinds between different ethnic groups, different regional groupings, and religious groupings, and so on. These 2 were highlighted as key to conflict. I haven't really heard much about policies or questions around inequalities between different sectors of the country or sectors within it. Is something that we should focus on in conflict. I'll skip the question about material support since we're not allowed.
Okay, ma'am, we'll take your question and then